Welcome to our channel, Seeds of Kindness. Here we are with a new kindness story. 10-year-old David Mitchell had always been a child with extraordinary curiosity. While other kids his age played video games or collected action figures, David's most prized possessions were his books about airplanes and his miniature aircraft models lined neatly on his bedroom shelves. He could spend hours watching documentaries about how engines worked, how pilots navigated storms, and how huge metal birds stayed in the sky. His parents often joked that his first word might as well have been takeoff. So when his mother surprised him with a plane ticket to visit his grandparents across the country, it felt to David as though he had been given a key to his dream world. The morning of the flight, David woke before his alarm, bubbling with excitement. He packed his small backpack carefully, making sure to include his notebook where he sketched airplane diagrams, his favorite pen, and a little guidebook titled Basics of Flight Controls for Kids. His mother double-checked everything, including the letter of permission for him to travel as an unaccompanied minor. David felt grown-up and proud as they drove to the airport, watching the planes through the window long before they even reached the terminal. Each airplane that roared overhead made his heart beat faster. Inside the bustling airport, David clung to his mother's hand, but his eyes wandered everywhere: flight gates, luggage carts, pilots walking briskly with crisp uniforms, and children pressing their faces to windows. He imagined himself in a pilot's seat, steering a massive machine through the clouds. When it was finally time to say goodbye, his mother hugged him tightly and whispered, "Be brave and have fun." The airline escort guided him aboard the plane, and David stepped inside with wide-eyed wonder. The aircraft was enormous, rows and rows of seats stretching farther than he expected. The friendly flight attendant, Ms. Green, helped him find his seat near the window. David practically glued himself to the glass, admiring the runway, the airport buildings, and the faint horizon in the distance. As the engines roared to life, he felt a thrill travel through his entire body. This was it. He was about to fly in the sky, not just read about it. The plane took off smoothly, climbing higher and higher until the world below looked like a giant patchwork quilt. David watched clouds drift past like cotton castles, and he let out an excited laugh when the sunlight sparkled across the wing. Everything felt magical, almost unreal. For a while he simply enjoyed the view, kicking his feet gently and imagining he was co-piloting the plane. But the magic didn't last long. A sudden jolt shook the aircraft. The lights flickered for a moment, and the seatbelt sign blinked on with a sharp ding. Passengers gasped, and the flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances. David felt his stomach twist, but he tried to stay calm. He told himself that turbulence was normal. He'd read about it many times. The plane shuddered again, this time harder, and a few passengers cried out. Something wasn't right. David noticed something else, a silence that felt strange. Usually the pilot's voice would reassure passengers during rough patches. But now there was nothing. No announcements. No instructions. Just the unsettling hum of engines fighting against unseen forces. Ms. Green rushed past David's row, heading quickly toward the cockpit. David watched her, swallowing hard. A few minutes later she came back, her face pale. She whispered to another attendant, and although they spoke softly, David caught fragments of their conversation, words like "no response," "something happened," and "we need assistance." His heart thumped painfully in his chest. His mind raced. What could be happening? The cabin grew tense. Some passengers whispered anxiously. Others squeezed their armrests. A baby began to cry somewhere behind him. David felt a mixture of fear and responsibility swirling inside him. He remembered reading about emergencies where pilots became incapacitated due to sudden medical events or extreme turbulence. Could it be something like that? Asterisk, he wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans. A part of him wanted to curl into his seat and wait for an adult to fix things. But another part, the part that studied flight diagrams for fun, told him something different. Stay alert. Stay ready. Asterisk, moments later, Ms. Green made an announcement, trying to keep her voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and seated. We are assessing a technical situation. But David heard the tremor in her voice. This wasn't normal. This wasn't routine. Asterisk, David's heart raced, not just with fear, but with a sense of looming destiny. Something was very wrong in the cockpit. Something that might require knowledge no one expected from a 10-year-old boy. Asterisk, he took a deep breath, feeling a strange determination settle over him. Asterisk, whatever was happening. Asterisk, David might be the only one who could help. David sat in his seat, gripping the armrests as the aircraft continued to tremble slightly. The murmurs of frightened passengers filled the cabin, blending with the hum of the engines. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself of every documentary he had watched, every page he had read about how planes were controlled and how pilots handled emergencies. But no amount of reading could completely prepare him for the possibility that something had happened to the people meant to be flying this enormous machine. Asterisk, Ms. Green reappeared in the aisle, trying to look calm, but David could see her hands trembling slightly as she steadied herself on the seatbacks. She knelt beside a crying toddler, soothing the child with a gentle voice that almost masked the fear beneath it. When she stood again, she scanned the rows as though searching for something, some clue, some answer, perhaps even a miracle. Asterisk, David swallowed hard. His heart pounded so loudly he could almost hear it. The strange silence from the cockpit still lingered. No reassuring words, no captain's voice. No co-pilot's smooth announcement reminding everyone to stay calm. Nothing. That wasn't normal. David knew that. Even during turbulence, pilots stayed in communication, especially with passengers. For them to say nothing, that meant something serious. Asterisk, another attendant hurried up the aisle and whispered urgently into Mrs. Green's ear. David saw her eyes widen before she masked her expression again. She turned toward the cockpit with a quick nod and disappeared inside. David's imagination spiraled. Were the pilots unconscious, hurt, unable to respond? Asterisk, minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The passengers shifted uneasily, whispering fears that seemed to leak into the air like cold fog. A man across the aisle muttered, "What is going on up there?" while a woman 2 rows behind wiped tears from her cheeks. The baby that had been crying earlier had begun again, perhaps sensing the tension that filled the cabin. Asterisk, David pressed his hand to his chest. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say something, anything to someone. But what would he say? "Hi, I'm 10, and I might understand the cockpit better than some people here?" That would sound ridiculous. Yet the feeling grew inside him, a heavy, insistent pressure pushing him toward action. He couldn't ignore it. Asterisk. Then Ms. Green finally emerged from the cockpit. Her face was pale. Too pale. Asterisk, she walked straight to the center of the aisle and gently tapped the intercom. Asterisk, ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice softer than before, we're experiencing a situation that requires calm and cooperation from everyone on board. Our crew is doing everything we can, and we ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Asterisk, the words were carefully chosen, too carefully. She was avoiding something. David could hear the truth hidden between her sentences. We have a problem we don't know how to solve. Asterisk, his pulse quickened. Asterisk, when Ms. Green passed by his row again, David couldn't stay silent any longer. Asterisk, ma'am, he said softly, hesitant but steady. Is something wrong with the pilots? She froze. For a moment, she didn't answer. She just stared at him, really looked at him, as though weighing whether to tell him anything. Her eyes reflected a mix of shock, fear, and disbelief that a child had guessed the very thing she didn't want passengers to know. Asterisk, how did you? She stopped herself, shook her head, and knelt beside him. Lowering her voice, she whispered, They're unresponsive, both of them. We don't know what happened. The autopilot is engaged, but we can't communicate with them. Asterisk David felt a surge of cold run through him. Unresponsive. Both. That was worse than anything he had. Imagine. Asterisk Ms. Green continued in a hushed tone. Right now. We're trying to contact the flight deck through the emergency system, but there's no answer. We have attendants who have trained for basic cockpit procedures, but none of us can actually fly the plane. Not fully. Not in a situation like this. Asterisk David's throat felt tight. He struggled to process the weight of her words. A plane full of people, 200 lives depending on a crew that couldn't control the aircraft. Depending on? Nobody. His breaths came faster. Ms. Green placed a gentle hand on his arm. It's going to be okay. We're doing everything. Asterisk, I can help. Asterisk, the words left his mouth before he even had time to think. Ms. Green blinked. What? Asterisk, I can help, David repeated, firmer this time. I know about flight controls. I know how autopilot works. I've studied planes since I was little. I've read manuals. I've watched pilots explain emergency procedures. Asterisk, her expression softened kind, but disbelieving. Sweetie, I know you're smart, but this is very complicated. The cockpit is not a place for asterisk. I'm not saying I can fly it, he insisted quickly, but I can understand things. Maybe I can talk to ground control, or read the instruments. I know what they mean. I promise I'm not joking. Asterisk Ms. Green stared at him, really stared. And beneath her fear, her disbelief, her hesitation, David saw something else. Asterisk hope. A tiny flicker of hope. And in that moment, she knew and he knew that they had no other choice. Come with me, she whispered, and David stood, ready to face the cockpit, ready to face the impossible. David followed Ms. Green up the narrow aisle, the eyes of passengers brushing against him like whispers. Most people didn't know what was happening, but a few noticed the small boy walking alongside the flight attendant. They watched with expressions that hovered between confusion and hope, as though sensing he had a purpose far greater than a child should carry. Asterisk, when they reached the cockpit door, Ms. Green tapped a security code into the panel. The heavy door clicked open, and David stepped inside. His breath caught in his chest. He had seen pictures of cockpits, diagrams, videos, but standing inside a real one full of blinking lights, glowing displays, and the quiet tension of crisis felt overwhelming. Asterisk, two pilots sat slumped in their seats, oxygen masks dangling uselessly from their faces. An attendant inside was checking their pulses, shaking her head slightly. They're alive, she whispered to Ms. Green, but still unconscious. No response. Asterisk, David's eyes darted around the cockpit altitude indicators, throttle levers, navigation screens, autopilot controls glowing steady and green. The plane was flying itself for now, but it wouldn't last forever. Fuel ran out. Weather changed. Systems malfunctioned. He knew that from every book he'd devoured. Asterisk, the radio crackled suddenly, a voice cutting through the silence. Flight 982, this is Sky Tower ground operations. Do you copy? We're detecting irregularities in your communications. Please respond. The attendants exchanged helpless looks. David swallowed, fear bubbling inside him, but he stepped forward. Asterisk, I'll answer, he said quietly. Asterisk, the attendants hesitated, but Ms. Green nodded and handed him the headset. Her voice trembled. Be careful. Just tell them what you see. David slipped the headset on. The ear pads felt enormous against his small head. His voice shook as he pressed the button. Sky Tower. This is Flight 982. I can hear you. There was a long pause. Who is this? The ground controller asked, sharp and confused. My name is David, he said, heart pounding. The pilots are unconscious. The flight attendants can't control the plane manually. The autopilot is on, but we need help. The response was immediate, urgent. David, listen carefully. How old are you? 10, he said, bracing for disbelief. But the controller didn't waste time. Okay, that's okay. We're going to work with you. Are you in the cockpit? Yes, sir. Good. I want you to look at the primary flight display. Tell me your altitude and heading. David scanned the instruments. The numbers made sense, comfortingly familiar. We're at 32,000 feet. Heading 0-9-0. There was another pause, quieter this time, as though the controller was speaking to someone beside him. Then he returned. Excellent work, David. You're doing great. The autopilot is keeping you stable. But eventually, someone will need to take manual control to land. Do you understand? David's stomach twisted. Yes. He had read about emergency landings. He had watched simulations. But this was real, the weight of 200 lives depending on him. He shivered, but his hands steadied themselves on the edge of the console. The controller continued gently. Right now, you're the only person on that plane who understands the instruments well enough to help us. We'll guide you every step of the way. David nodded even though they couldn't see him. Ms. Green placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. You can do this, she whispered. First, the controller said, we need to check your fuel levels. Look at the engine display bottom left. Tell me what the fuel gauges show. David leaned in. It says we have about 90 minutes left. That's plenty. We're going to bring you in for an emergency landing at the nearest airport. But before that, I need you to familiarize yourself with the control yoke. That's the steering wheel in front of the pilot's seat. David stepped toward the captain's chair. It felt enormous, like sitting at the helm of a spaceship. He carefully placed his hands on the yoke. His palms were damp, but he didn't let go. Good, the controller said. Don't move it yet. Just get a feel for it. David nodded. Now look at the throttle levers on your right. They control your speed. The black levers glinted under the cockpit lights. Okay, David whispered. You're doing incredibly well. David, now I want you to take a deep breath. He inhaled shakily. We will guide you through disconnecting the autopilot when it's time. But for now, keep everything as it is. Can you confirm that the plane is stable? David checked the displays again. Altitude steady. Airspeed steady. No warnings flashing. Yes, stable. Good. That's very good. We're going to send you coordinates. When you're ready, you'll begin a gradual descent. Ms. Green exhaled shakily, relief flickering in her eyes. You're amazing, she whispered. But David didn't feel amazing. He felt terrified. Terrified. But, determined. He tightened his grip on the yoke, his feet barely reaching the floor. The responsibility was enormous. The danger was real. But he wasn't backing down, not when 200 lives depended on him. And so, the 10-year-old boy prepared himself to do the impossible, fly the plane.
David sat in the captain's seat, his small hands resting firmly on the yoke. The cockpit hummed softly, illuminated by blinking lights that reflected off his determined eyes. Behind him, Miss Green and the other attendants stood silently, watching the 10-year-old boy who had become their unexpected hope. The radio crackled again. "David," the controller said gently, "we're ready to begin descent. Are you ready?" David swallowed, feeling his heartbeat echo through his entire body. "Yes, I'm ready." "Okay. First, reduce your altitude on the autopilot panel. Turn the altitude dial from 32,000 to 15,000, slowly." David's fingers trembled, but he turned the dial exactly as instructed. The plane responded almost immediately, its nose dipping gently. He felt the pressure shift, a sensation that would have frightened him earlier in the flight, but now it only sharpened his focus. "Good job, David. Now reduce speed slightly. Move the throttle levers a little back very gently." David nudged the levers, feeling the engine soften. The controller's voice came through again, warm and steady. "You're doing perfectly. The passengers are safe. You're safe. Stay calm." David breathed deeply. His fear didn't vanish, but it settled into something he could carry, something he could control. As the plane descended through the clouds, the passengers began to feel the change. Some looked around nervously. Others whispered hopes and prayers. They still didn't know a boy was guiding the aircraft, but they could sense something. USUALM's Green made one final announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing. Please remain calm and follow all instructions. You're safe." Her voice was steady, strong, because she believed in David. The plane broke through the clouds, revealing the faint glimmer of a city below. Airport runway lights shone like long glowing paths in the darkness. David stared at them, awestruck and terrified all at once. "David," the controller said, "you're approaching the airport. In a moment we'll turn off the autopilot and you will land the plane manually." His breath caught. "Okay, you can do this. I'll tell you every step." David nodded, gripping the yoke with renewed determination. "Turn off the autopilot switch." His finger hovered for a second. Then click. The plane shifted slightly as manual control transferred to his small hands. The weight of the aircraft felt enormous, like holding a wild creature trying to pull away, but David held on. "Good. Keep the nose straight. Look at the horizon indicator." "I see it," he whispered. "Gently pull back the throttle." "Not too much." David eased the levers backward. The plane slowed. "You're lined up with the runway. Keep it steady." Lights raced toward them, bright white stripes leading them home. "Lower the landing gear," the controller said. David flipped the switch. A deep rumble sounded beneath the aircraft David flipped the switch. A deep rumble sounded beneath the aircraft as the wheels unfolded. "Perfect. Now, slight pull on the yoke. Not hard, just enough." David followed the instructions. The runway growing larger and larger in the cockpit window. Hold, steady, and flare the nose a bit." David pulled gently. Thud. The wheels touched down. The plane bounced once. David felt his heart leap, but then it settled, rolling firmly along the runway. He pushed the brakes exactly as the controller described, and finally, the plane came to a complete stop. For a moment, there was only silence. Then an explosion of cheers erupted from behind him. Passengers cried, hugged, clapped, shouted words of joy and gratitude. The attendants covered their mouths, tears filling their eyes. Miss Green knelt beside David, her voice choked with emotion. "You did it. You really did it." David removed the headset slowly, his hands still trembling, not from fear anymore, but from the overwhelming realization of what he had just accomplished. The cockpit door opened, and he stepped out to a corridor filled with applause. Passengers reached out to touch his shoulder, to thank him, to smile through tears. Firefighters and airport medics rushed in, but even they paused when they learned who had landed the plane. A 10-year-old boy, a child who refused to give up, a hero. Reporters later surrounded him, calling him the miracle boy pilot, the youngest lifesaver, the child who saved 200 lives. But David only shrugged shyly, saying the same simple words over and over. "I just wanted everyone to get home safely." And he had, because courage doesn't wait for age. Sometimes it finds the smallest hands at the biggest moments.